Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're tackling a pretty big one. What's the meaning of life? It's a question that's been around forever, and we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help us out, specifically their entry on the meaning of life.
Oh yeah, that's a really good resource.
Yeah.
It goes into a ton of detail about all the different ways philosophers have thought about it, throughout history.
Totally. And while we could probably spend, I don't know, years talking about every single theory, we're going to focus on what it means for you to have a meaningful life. The kind of life where you wake up and you feel like your existence has some kind of purpose.
Yeah, that's a super important distinction. We're not talking about some abstract meaning of life for like humanity as a whole.
Hmm.
We're really interested in like what makes your individual life feel meaningful to you.
Exactly. And before we get too deep into the, I don't know, the philosophical weeds, maybe we should just start with something simple. Like, what does meaning even mean in this context?
Well, that's a great question. There are a few things that philosophers generally tend to agree on. First, having a meaningful life is usually seen as a good thing. It's something that most people want. And second, meaningfulness isn't like an on-off switch. It comes in degrees. So it's not like you either have a meaningful life or you don't. And third, and this is interesting, a meaningful life isn't necessarily the same thing as a happy life or a morally good life.
So, wait, are you saying that just because I'm having fun or doing good deeds, that doesn't automatically mean my life is meaningful?
Yeah, precisely. Like, imagine someone who wins the lottery, right? They spend their days just relaxing, traveling the world, having a blast. Sounds pretty amazing. But would you say their life is, like, deeply meaningful? A lot of philosophers would say probably not.
Hmm. Yeah, I see what you mean. There's got to be something more to it than just feeling good or being a good person.
Exactly. It's not just about what's happening on the surface. And to make things even more interesting, there's this whole idea of anti-meaning. Are there things that actually make your life less meaningful? Things that we should maybe try to avoid?
Okay, anti-meaning. That's definitely a new one for me. I'm really curious to hear more about that. But I guess before we go there, we should probably talk about the two main camps when it comes to thinking about meaning, supernaturalism and naturalism.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So, supernaturalism basically says that meaning comes from a spiritual realm, whether it's God, a soul, or something beyond the physical world.
So if I believe that God gives my life meaning, that would put me in the supernaturalist camp.
You got it. And within supernaturalism, you've got extreme views and moderate views. Extreme supernaturalists believe that you absolutely need a spiritual realm for life to have any meaning at all. Moderate supernaturalists think it can make life more meaningful, but it's not strictly necessary.
Okay, so an extreme supernaturalist would say that without God, my life has no meaning. But a moderate supernaturalist might say that I can still have a meaningful life. It just might not be as meaningful as it could be. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the God-centered views within supernaturalism, those are some of the most interesting ones. The classic argument is that God has a specific purpose for each of us, like a plan that we're meant to fulfill. And the more we align our lives with that purpose, the more meaningful our lives become.
So it's like God's the screenwriter and we're just the actors following his script.
Yeah, a lot of people use that analogy.
Yeah.
But it has some issues. I mean, wouldn't that mean we don't have free will? If God's already decided everything, how can our choices really matter?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's hard to feel like I'm in control of my life if it's all predetermined. But what about people who live these incredible, meaningful lives without, explicitly following a plan from God? Like, think about someone like Mother Teresa or Nelson Mandela.
Right. Their lives are seen as incredibly meaningful. But did they really follow some kind of, traditional divine plan? Not necessarily. And that's why a lot of people find moderate supernaturalism a bit more appealing.
So they see God more as like a bonus level of meaning, not the only source.
Exactly. It's like God's existence gives our lives this kind of ultimate significance. Our actions have more weight because they're part of a much bigger story.
But I could also see how that might feel overwhelming for some people. Like, wouldn't God's presence overshadow all our own efforts to create meaning?
For sure. In fact, there's a philosopher, Guy Kahan, and he argues that our lives actually have more meaning because we're alone in the universe. There's no God dictating our purpose.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to look at it. It sounds like this debate about God's role in meaning is far from over. But what about those soul-centered views, the ones that focus on having an immortal soul?
Yeah. Those are all about the idea that the soul itself is what makes life meaningful. It's not so much about God's plan, but about the inherent nature of the soul.
So even if there wasn't a God, my life could still be meaningful because I have a soul that exists beyond my physical body.
Exactly. The extreme version of this view would be like, if you don't have a soul, or if you don't cultivate your soul in the right way, your life just can't be meaningful.
Okay, so how does having a soul supposedly give life meaning?
Well, there are a few main arguments. One really famous one was made by Leo Tolstoy. He said that for life to be meaningful, there have to be something worth doing,
Right.
and something's only worth doing if it has a lasting impact.
Yeah, I can see that. But we're all going to die someday, so how can anything we do really last?
That's exactly the point. That's where the soul comes in. Tolstoy argued that only an immortal soul can achieve true permanence, and that makes our actions meaningful in the grand scheme of things.
I see. But doesn't that kind of make all the things we do in this life seem pointless? I mean, helping someone in need is still meaningful, even if the impact doesn't last forever, right?
You've hit on one of the big criticisms of Tolstoy's argument. A lot of philosophers would say that temporary actions can definitely be deeply meaningful. Think about raising a child or creating a work of art or just, making someone smile. Those things have value in themselves, whether they have an eternal impact or not.
Welcome back, everyone. We just finished exploring some pretty intense stuff, those soul-centered ideas within supernaturalism, that idea that meaning comes from some kind of spiritual realm. Phew.
It's a lot to process, right?
It is.
Yeah.
But now we're switching gears completely. We're going to explore
All right,
naturalists.
so instead of looking to God or a soul for meaning, naturalism says we can find it right here in the physical world.
Okay, so with naturalism, a meaningful life is possible even without believing in anything supernatural.
Exactly. Naturalists really focus on the here and now, the things we can experience through our senses and understand through science.
That sounds pretty down to earth, I guess you could say. So if I find meaning in my relationships or my job or my hobbies, that makes me a naturalist.
Yeah, that's the idea. You find meaning in the things you do and experience in this world. And just like supernaturalism, there are different kinds of naturalists.
Yeah.
Some are moderate, meaning they're open to the idea that a spiritual realm could add something to the meaning of life, but they don't think it's essential. Then you've got the extreme naturalist. They actually think believing in God or a soul could take away from meaning.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. I definitely want to hear more about that later. But first, let's break down these two main types of naturalism you mentioned, subjectivism and objectivism.
Sure. So subjectivism is all about you, your choices, your personal fulfillment. It says that meaning is relative to each person. So it's about your desires, your goals, what matters to you.
So my life is meaningful if I'm following my passions and achieving my goals. That sounds pretty great.
Right. It's all about authenticity, being true to yourself. It's like saying, you do you, and that's what makes your life meaningful.
I can see why people like that. No need to search for some kind of external meaning. You get to decide what's worthwhile for you. But aren't there any problems with that view?
That's a great question. Some people worry that subjectivism could lead to some pretty strange conclusions. Like, if meaning is totally subjective, then couldn't anything be meaningful, even really silly stuff?
I see what you mean. Like, what if someone's biggest passion is counting blades of grass? Would we really say that's meaningful?
Exactly. That's the kind of thing critics of subjectivism point to. They say there has to be some kind of standard beyond just personal preference. Otherwise, anything goes.
Yeah, anything goes doesn't feel quite right when we're talking about something as important as meaning.
Right. And that's where objectivism comes in. Objectivism says that some things just are meaningful, no matter what any individual person thinks. It's like there are certain activities or accomplishments that are objectively valuable, regardless of whether someone enjoys them or not.
So some things are just inherently worthwhile, like what kind of things?
Well, there isn't one set list or anything. But think about stuff like pursuing truth, creating beauty, acting morally, building strong relationships with other people. Those are things that a lot of people would say are objectively meaningful.
Yeah.
They connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
I get it. It's like they tap into something that goes beyond our individual lives.
Exactly. And that actually leads to another key idea that objectivists focus on the importance of the whole life.
The whole life. What does that mean?
It's the idea that meaning isn't just about all the good stuff that happens to you. It's about how it all fits together, the pattern of your life, like the narrative.
So it's more than just adding up the happy moments.
Yeah, exactly. It's about the overall shape of your life, how the pieces connect to make a coherent story. Like a movie where the main character is always on vacation might not be very interesting, even if it seems fun on the surface.
Yeah.
We need something more, right?
Mm.
Challenges, growth, purpose, that kind of stuff. That's what makes a story or a life truly meaningful.
I like that. It's like a good story needs conflict to be interesting.
Right. And speaking of conflict, it's time to tackle those extreme naturalists who think God and the soul could actually hurt the meaning of life. Ready for that?
Oh, yeah, bring it on. I'm ready to hear how they make that argument. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring this big question, what's the meaning of life? We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We sure have. Supernaturalism, naturalism, it's been quite a journey.
It has, and we ended last time on a bit of a cliffhanger with those extreme naturalists, the ones who think that believing in God or having a soul could actually make life less meaningful. I'm still kind of struggling with that one, to be honest.
It's definitely an unconventional way of thinking about it.
It is. So, help me out here. How do they make that argument?
Well, one of their main points is what some people call the master-servant problem. It
Oh.
basically challenges that traditional religious idea that God is the master and we humans are his servants.
Okay, yeah, I can see where they're going with that. If we're always serving a higher power, how can we really be free to create our own meaning? Like, our lives are just a small part of God's plan.
Exactly. Philosophers like Guy Kahan, he argues that a God-given purpose can actually feel more like a limitation than a source of meaning. Like you're fulfilling someone else's agenda, not your own.
It's like you're given the script and you have to just follow it. No room for improvisation. But what about the meaning we find in helping others? Isn't that often seen as a meaningful thing to do?
It absolutely can be. But the key difference is choice. If you choose to help others, that's an expression of your own values. It comes from you. But if you're just following a command from God, well, it's not really coming from you.
I see. It's like the difference between volunteering to help out at a soup kitchen because you want to and being forced to do community service as a punishment.
Yeah.
One feels meaningful, the other just feels like an obligation.
Right. Exactly. And this idea of divine commands kind of limiting our freedom leads to another really interesting argument, the privacy problem.
Privacy. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How does privacy relate to the meaning of life?
Well, if God is omniscient, if he knows everything we've ever done, are doing, and will do, where's the room for real self-discovery?
Oh, wow, yeah. It's like having a cosmic security camera on you 24/7. No surprises, no room for mistakes.
Right. And some people would say that those moments of uncertainty, those moments where you don't know what's going to happen, are actually crucial for a meaningful life. You know, it's those moments that allow us to make real choices, to
Mhm.
carve our own paths, to experience the full range of human emotions.
I like that. It's like those unexpected twists and turns in a movie. Those are the things that keep us on the edge of our seats. A life without any surprises would be pretty boring.
Exactly. So we've looked at some arguments against God limiting our meaning. But what about the soul? How could that be a downside when it comes to meaning?
Yeah, that's the part I just can't quite get my head around. How could living forever be a bad thing?
Well, one concern is boredom. I mean, if you lived forever, wouldn't you eventually run out of things to do? Wouldn't life start to feel repetitive and meaningless?
Yeah, I guess so. It's like, watching your favorite movie over and over again. Eventually, it just gets old.
Right.
Yeah.
There's this philosopher, Bernard Williams, and he argued that even if you had an endless supply of new experiences, the fact that they were endless would eventually make them meaningless. There's no sense of urgency, no sense that each moment is precious.
That makes me think about how we tend to value things more when they're rare, like a first edition of a book or a limited edition sneaker.
Yeah.
Maybe that's part of what makes life meaningful, knowing that it doesn't last forever.
That's a really interesting point. The limits of our lives, those limits might actually be what gives our lives meaning. And speaking of limits, there's another potential downside to immortality, lack of urgency. I mean, if you have forever to do something, why do it now?
Oh, yeah, tell me about it. I'm the queen of procrastination.
Exactly. It's human nature to put things off, especially when you think you have all the time in the world. But knowing that your time is limited, well, that can be a powerful motivator. It pushes us to make the most of our lives, to figure out what really matters, to go after what we want.
I'm starting to see how these limitations, these things we often complain about, those might actually be the key to a meaningful life.
It's a bit of a paradox, right?
Yeah.
That our limits might actually be what shapes us and gives us meaning.
It's like a sculptor working with a block of marble. The limitations of the material, those force the sculptor to make choices, to shape the stone into something specific. Without those limits, they could create anything, but maybe the result wouldn't be as beautiful or meaningful.
I love that analogy. And maybe that's the main takeaway from all of this. There isn't one right answer to the question of meaning. There's no magic formula.
Yeah, it seems like it's about embracing the journey, finding things that make us feel alive, that connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe the search for meaning, that's what gives life meaning. The curiosity, the questioning. That's part of what makes us human.
I love that. So to all of you listening out there, keep searching, keep questioning. Don't be afraid to explore and discover what makes life meaningful for you.
And remember, you get to decide what your meaning is. Nobody else can tell you.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the meaning of life. Until next time, keep seeking, keep growing, and keep living a life that feels meaningful to you.